All right, let's get started so we have time for everybody. I'm Pooja Agrawal. I am a former president of AWAEM. I'm currently on the SAEM board of directors, and I am so thrilled to have this didactic for all of you. So what this is basically is called Confronting Disparities Through Evidence. This is our AWAEM research in progress for 2022. So disclosures, like I said, I'm on the board of directors. Dr. Acuna, Dr. Moriarty, Dr. Tsai, and Dr. Westerfer were funded by the AWAEM Research Funding Award, and Dr. Parsons was funded by the SAEM Foundation AWAEM grant. So what is the AWAEM Research Funding Award? It has two main functions. One is to support projects that are aligned with the AWAEM mission, so for the promotion and advancement of women in academic emergency medicine and kind of factors that are relevant to our demographic, and also to support AWAEM members in their research efforts as a little bit of seed funding for projects that they're looking to do and may not otherwise get funded by larger sources. The application for this is very simple. We do that intentionally. It's ideal for pilot projects, small projects. You can just small amount of funding for honoraria, for paying for a data scientist or something, a small amount. Something that may not be funded by another source. Very few requirements. There's no letters required. You don't have to go through your grants department. It is literally funding for your work. We want to see that you have a well thought out plan, some kind of a budget, and that you want to do a project that's relevant and that's important. And we made it, like I said, easy for a reason. The application is simple, and every year I try to provide this forum for a presentation, for a national presentation to actually disseminate your work so that people can start hearing about what you're doing and you can start writing about it. So this is all kind of put in together as a little package for you. Like I said, the goals of this talk are twofold: to create a national forum to hear about this amazing work that AWAEM members are doing, and also to stimulate ideas for you to think about yourself, to think about your residents, think about your students, and work that may be generating in your departments. Think about how you could apply for this award, or your juniors can apply for this award, and also get funding to support their work and stimulate more research coming out of AWAEM, coming out of SAEM, coming out of emergency medicine. Here are our amazing presentations today. We're going to start off with Dr. Acuna, moving on to Dr. Shafi, who works with Dr. Moriarty, and then Dr. Parsons, Dr. Tsai, and Dr. Westerfer. We'll kind of read the names of their presentations when we get to them. And this is going to be rapid fire. So, Dr. Acuna, the floor is yours.
Yes, and let me know if I'm going too far on time. I'll try to be quick. Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm Josie Acuna from the University of Arizona. First of all, thank you so much to AWAEM for the exposure. It's a really great thing you all are doing, and so I'm very thankful. My study is the current status of gender disparities in emergency ultrasound fellowship programs. So this is a large survey study. The objectives were fairly simple. First and foremost, I wanted to investigate for the existence of a gender difference in the percentage of men and women who have completed an emergency ultrasound fellowship, and this was over a 4-year period. Secondary objectives was to also evaluate the career paths and accomplishments of women specifically who have completed this fellowship. This was an online survey of the emergency ultrasound fellowship programs in the U.S. 109 programs were identified. I realize there are more out there if you go to the to the SCUF website. However, a lot of them are new, so I didn't want to pick any that were made within the last 3 years because they wouldn't have a full set of data. And also there were some which had never had a fellow yet. So 109 programs were identified to choose from. I emailed all of the program directors to take part in the study and complete the survey. The survey questions were broken down into 3 groups: program demographics, a summary of fellowship classes, and I'll show you an example of what that question looked like. And then we also had some questions on the program director's perspective. This is kind of what for each year, 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019, and so on, for a total of 4 years, this is what this looked like. First, I asked the program directors to list what their fellows identified as: male, female, transgender, non-gender conforming, unknown. And then we took the number of females, and they say of the female fellows that completed fellowship in this particular year, how many did this? So how many took a position in academic medicine sense? How many completed a project, received an award or recognition? How many held a leadership position at their own institution? And then how many have held a leadership position nationally? Which is kind of an interesting question, these last two, because we're doing the last 4 most recent years. So it'd be surprising to see if somebody who's just come out of fellowship already has a leadership position nationally, and I'll show you some of the results. We had a 67% response rate, so I got a response from 75 programs. I just highlighted some, there's a lot of results, obviously, but in maybe a few minutes, I kind of wanted to circle out the things that were most interesting to me. For the most part, program directors perceive their emergency department to be very inclusive, at the very least, somewhat inclusive. And I thought this is interesting. A number of programs that consider gender when recruiting fellows for ultrasound fellowship, 58.9% do not consider gender. Which again it's kind of hard to know what to really take away from that. Is it because they feel that they're getting, equal amount of female fellows per year, or do they not see that there is a gender difference or a problem, or maybe they don't feel that fellowship is really a pipeline to academic medicine, or they just haven't considered it because maybe some of the data is just not out there and it's not something people are even thinking of. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Whoa, had a animation there. From the responding programs, we identified 146 female fellows that were reported to have graduated from 2017 through 2021. We looked to see, my first objective was to see is there a gender difference in the number of men and women percentage who have completed a fellowship over the 4 years, and there was not. So that kind of went against my initial hypothesis. We were initially thinking there might be a gender difference, and that would lead us to make some conclusions. But surprisingly, there was not a significant finding. So that's that's great for the world of emergency ultrasound. I think this is I feel like I'm taking so long already. I'm sorry. Doing a summary of the fellowship classes, I think this was really the meat of the project that I found most interesting, because this really highlights how I think vital a fellowship can be to really getting your academic career up and running. So the number of females that took a position in academic medicine was 45%, which is great because I think the last numbers I saw, women in academic medicine only made up about 38 point something percent of the academic workforce. So 45 going into academic medicine straight out of fellowship is really encouraging. The number that completed a project, 65%, which is again encouraging because when you're starting to build your CV, when you're starting to look at, moving from, assistant to associate professor, you want to get research and scholarly project experience. And getting that early on where you have a fellowship director is so helpful. Kind of helps get you interested, somebody to mentor you through the process for that first year. Number that received an award, 14%. It's hard to get awards, and I know it sounds kind of silly, but awards make you feel good. I think they make you feel valued, and I think so many women leave academic medicine, especially as we're seeing mid-careers, because you just lose that sense of value and belonging. So say what you will, I like awards. I think they're great. If you're receiving one early on, you're kind of gives you motivation, just keep going, keep working. And then these last two were great. The fellows that held just after recent graduation, held a leadership position, 60.3% at their own institution, which is amazing. And then this was super impressive, 10%, even out of just maybe at the most 4 years of graduating fellowship, already hold a leadership position nationally. We asked program directors what they considered to be a barrier, if any, that were specific to women when applying to programs. Out of the 75 program directors, only 28 of them felt that there were significant barriers that specifically deterred women from applying and completing a fellowship program. That was actually surprising. I personally, obviously, I'm biased because I'm here. I think there are more barriers that specifically deter women from applying and completing fellowships. And then of these 28, these are some of the potential barriers that they thought. I think concerns that fellowship will delay other significant life events is a huge one, 67.9%. And then also, if you notice, lack of mentoring on pursuing fellowship. Sometimes people don't know, what does fellowship have to offer me? Which is the right one for me? Where should I go? 42.9% for that. I know I'm running out of time a little bit. Again, we hypothesized that initially that maybe completing fellowship is one way we can kind of help feed the pipeline to academic medicine. I think a lot of these results, kind of point towards that. Again, it gives us more opportunities to succeed, really sets us up for success. I think in this world where I had all this free time and money to complete giant studies, I would love to look at this on a larger scale at all EM-based fellowships, not just emergency ultrasound, because perhaps in other fellowships there are gender differences in a percentage of men and women that are completing fellowship, or that new barriers exist, like EMS toxicology, with the U.S. being a somewhat newer fellowship compared to the others. Perhaps that leads to a more inclusive sort of fellowship body. But anyway, like I said, while we're really happy that the news for ultrasound looks like it's bright for the future, we are only looking at a 4-year period. It would have been interesting to look at even 4 years behind that, but nobody would have filled out that survey because it was quite long as it was, and I was trying to be really cognizant of everyone's time. Anyway, I will stop there. Sorry, I have a lot to say, but I will let the next presenter go. Any questions, please email me, find me on Twitter. Hopefully, this was sent out for publication, so we'll see if I get any responses back. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Ansa Shafi. I am one of the upcoming chief residents at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, and I worked with Dr. Moriarty and Dr. Dehan on this project, evaluating the effects of sponsorship, mentorship, and networking on career outcomes for men and women in academic emergency medicine. This study was supported by a grant from AWAEM, otherwise no other disclosures or conflicts of interest. And we believe that this topic is of particular importance because there are a large proportion of women in academic emergency medicine. However, only 10% of clinical, of clerkship, or chairs, EM department chairs are, 10% are women, and 17% of full professors are women. We looked at a 2013 AEM study that showed that women in leadership roles tend to work more clinical hours. However, they still have lower salaries than their male counterparts, and some of those discrepancies are here. In looking for remedies for this problem, we looked at different sectors, and in particular, we were interested in the business sector. They showed that sponsorship, more than mentorship, made a significant impact on career advancement. However, sponsorship has not been studied in academic emergency medicine. So there were 2 aims to this study. The first one was to evaluate the effects of sponsorship, mentorship, and networking on objective and subjective career outcomes, as well as identifying gender discrepancies in career advancement as it relates to those 3 same variables. So surveys were sent out from May of 2020 to February of 2021, and it asked about some of the things on the slide. We defined mentors in line with literature as someone who supports and advises, versus a sponsor is usually someone of higher academic rank who advocates for career advancement, sometimes at a sacrifice to him or herself. We looked at networking both in the department, across one's institution, and outside of one's medical center. So we sent this survey out to about 15 sites across the country. 234 EM physicians filled out the survey, which was a response rate of about 22%. And we did have a professional statistician help us with our statistical analysis. We had medians and interquartile ranges for numerical values and percentages and frequencies for categorical values. We used a logistic regression model to evaluate mentorship, sponsorship, and networking for competitive salary and career satisfaction. And we adjusted for variables such as marital status, number of children, and tenure status. And there are multiple visual aids that we'll look at in just a moment. So these are the demographics of the survey respondents. We had about a 50-50 ratio on male and female. A lot of our respondents were assistant professors. So if you look right here, you'll see that of the men, 40% of the men that responded were assistant professors versus 59% of the women that responded were. In the full professor role, 25% of men were full professors versus only 9% of women were, which was interesting. This shows annual salary data by rank and gender. So the most stark difference that you'll see is here at the instructor role. Females reported an annual salary of about $100,000 to $200,000 versus men reported an annual salary of about $250,000 to $300,000. We're not sure where this big discrepancy comes from. It could be possibly that females did not report bonuses, stipends, salary versus RVU compensation versus men did. There's another difference over here in the full professor section where the median annual salary reported by females was about $330,000, and for males it was about $370,000. We looked at competitive salary. Competitive salary was defined at $300,000 a year. Especially in the networking engagement section, you'll see that there is a more positive linear correlation, especially in the women's trend line, as well as in the sponsorship trend line. So that suggests that with more networking engagement and then more number of sponsors, there's more likely a chance that women are having a more competitive salary. This looked at career satisfaction, also within those three variables. Interesting here in the networking section, there is a very steep linear correlation across both genders. However, with more frequent networking engagement here, you'll see that women with frequent networking engagement oftentimes surpass their male counterparts in their satisfaction of their career. There's also positive linear correlation in sponsorship as well. Mentors, if you look at that only one mentor, women were significantly less satisfied in their career. However, two or more mentors, women were significantly more satisfied. And we'll dive into that a little bit more here. So these are scatter plots that look at networking engagement and how that is affected by number of children. We looked at three different realms. Particularly outside the medical center, that was the most interesting. You'll see that the red line represents women, and that is a more fluctuant line compared to the other lines in the other realms. And that suggests that maybe women with more children are looking for networking engagement, both for personal as well as professional reasons. So there are limitations of the study, along with inherent limitations of survey research, including response bias, misunderstanding or misinterpretation of questions, as well as skipped questions. So a lot of people skipped the annual salary question, which was interesting. About 60% of men did. The sample size was relatively small. Response rate was 22%. Our salary reporting was self-reported, which was another limitation. Part-time, we did not define either. And then we assumed that the survey respondents wanted higher academic rank and were pursuing leadership roles, based our study off that assumption. So in conclusion, although we couldn't say there was a stark difference in objective career outcomes across genders in relationship to sponsorship, networking, and mentorship, we did see that especially with networking behaviors and mentorship, we saw differences in career satisfaction. So women involved in more networking engagement, and particularly women who had more than 3 children, were more involved in networking engagement and therefore more satisfied in their career. We saw that women with more than one mentor were significantly more satisfied than in their career in comparison to those with only one mentor. Salary data was consistent with previous data research that showed that especially in the full professor position and in the instructor position, men were making still higher salaries than women. Some future directions, possibly. One would be a larger national study using objective salary data. And another one, which would be interesting, would be a prospective study. So taking recent residency graduates, following them throughout their academic careers and evaluating them throughout to see their involvement in networking, sponsorship, mentorship, and see how that affects academic rank and career satisfaction. And that's it. Thank you so much.
So that was an excellent lead-in to my study, because we're going to talk more about networking. My study, Breaking Through the Glass Ceiling, Networking Practices of Women in Emergency Medicine. And I'm not going to be presenting any data because we are actually still collecting all of our data. We just applied for an extension on our grant. But I do have to mention, so we're part of a direct group, a research group, so it stands for Diversity, Inclusion, Research, and Education Collaboration Team. So a big thank you to all of the names on the screen, because they're involved in this grant with me. So I think most of us in the room probably will have already accepted that there's a leadership gap in emergency medicine. That's, I think, what most of our studies thus far are trying to look at, is how do we close this gap. And as we alluded to previously in the business literature, we do see that networking impacts the ability of women to excel in their career, promote. And so what we don't know is how do we best network in emergency medicine, in academic medicine, to continue that growth and career trajectory and to try to close that leadership gap. So our study is based off a study by Carboni et al. In the business literature on how successful women manage their networks. And we have a constructivist grounded theory approach. We have we're basically looking at women who have been extremely successful in academic emergency medicine. So starting with a list of chairs of academic emergency medicine that are female, we're only surveying females, and then also using snowball sampling from there. So once we interview them, they can give us other women that they think have been extremely successful in their career that we can interview on their networking. At this point, the big thing that we've done is we have created a rather large survey or interview survey structure that we piloted on 5 women in emergency medicine and then refined, and honestly that took us all of 6 months just to keep editing these questions and how do we get to the meat of what we can do better in emergency medicine. And the goals of it really are we want to be able to come out with a product that we can bring to AWAEM and say, okay, here's what we know, here's what successful women in EM have done so far, and how can we teach that to the younger generations of females that are coming out, and even, you know, some of us in this room may find things that we can use to advance our career moving forward. So those are kind of the goals of what we're trying to do. The big challenges that we've had is to get this information actually takes a lot of time from these women, and you're asking chairs to spend an hour plus. Initially, our first round of piloting, we were taking an hour and a half to do the survey, and that was just unrealistic. We also were initially trying to have the members of our research team interview all of these applicants and trying to line up, you know, my emergency medicine schedule with a chair's EM schedule was not gonna work. So we have research, our RAs from my institution that are actually conducting the studies at this point, or the interviews. We've done 5 interviews so far, and we're meeting to start doing our data collection this week on that. So we are excited to start to see what information comes in and what we're getting out of it. But that is kind of where we're at this point. So hopefully next year I will be presenting what we have, and we will be able to do that.
Wait, no, I'm not. We did line up in order. I am
You
not.
walked in so confidently, I was like, oh. I'm going to use the table if that's okay. Can you guys, do I need to use the mic?
They're recording.
All right, I need to use the mic. So this room in particular knows already that gender and race-based discrimination exists across different parts and every level of training in medicine. This manifests as mistreatment, disparities in clerkship grades, honor society inductions, financial compensation. We know that this list goes on. We also know that this happens at a time when diversity and inclusion in the physician workforce is still an active issue. Black trainees, for example, are still matriculating and enrolling at half their expected rate, and this is despite national efforts to increase matriculation. As a result, even then, underrepresented minorities in medicine have not significantly changed in the past decades. So among these existing inequities, the ones that stood out to me most were the studies that demonstrated harsher, more punitive, and less positive performance reviews for trainees who are women or people of color. So I wanted to focus on performance for a number of reasons. One, because the existing literature points a pretty damning finger at it. For example, a recent study found gender disparities in EM milestone scores. And actually, when they extrapolated this gender bias, it meant that women EM residents would need to have an additional 3 to 4 months of residency training to graduate at the same level as their male peers. Obviously, I care about that. Second, performance evaluations are by nature subjective. That intuitively leaves them to be especially vulnerable to biases. Third, performance is inevitably attached to performance, promotion, and advancement. Lastly, it felt really salient to me that inequity had a twofold hit on performance. It wasn't only that there were biased reviews and unfair appraisals of skill, but the lack of inclusion itself has been shown to inhibit the performance of people who feel outside of their work environment. So gender and race-based mistreatment is related to depression, higher professional turnover, decreased wellness, and all of those things add to lower performance. I think this is very intuitive, being viewed as less capable, receiving unfair assessments, constantly facing microaggressions and insults, feeling undervalued, facing social isolation. These are obstacles to feeling good and doing well at work. So despite the fact that LCME accreditation standards on diversity have been in place at the undergraduate level since 2009, 27% of medical schools are still deemed non-compliant. They struggle to meet these standards, and that indicates to me that there needs to be dedicated labor on the part of residency programs as well in order to avoid similar issues. To focus more specifically, as some of these issues pertain to residency, I chose to focus on attrition and promotion to chief resident. In addition to that study about EM milestones, another statistic that I think is compelling and emblematic: minority physicians are almost 30% more likely to withdraw from residency and 8 times more likely to take a leave of absence due to performance difficulties specifically. Couple extra notes on attrition that I think are relevant. Residency attrition is estimated to be about 5%. This is significant, again, given that the U.S. is predicted to face a physician shortage of almost 100,000 providers in the next decade. Issues with performance are one of the top cited reasons for attrition, especially for underrepresented physicians. This also matters from an equity lens because physicians who leave residency without graduating can still provide medical care and are actually more likely to provide that medical care in underserved areas. So if these are physicians who actually need more training rather than less training, this adds to the issue of injustice. Moving on to chief residency, it's often understood as a position of prestige. It's been mentioned already in this room. Traditionally, it's related to clinical skill and performance, but to date, there have been no empiric data to actually show that this is the case. We think we know what it means and what we're looking for when we look for chief residents, but we don't actually know if that's panning out. This means, once again, there's significant opportunity for biases to infiltrate. And it brought up my own questions, which other people have brought up before. Is chief residency selection actually related to performance? And if it is related to performance, do pre-existing biases impact the promotion of women and trainees of color to chief residency? The preliminary literature shows that across specialties right now, women are overall less likely to be selected for chief resident. Even when selected, women chief residents report that faculty are less helpful and supportive, that they feel less prepared even with the same qualifications. They are also half as likely to self-report themselves as leaders, which is a self-appraisal that has been linked to higher honors, more academic publications, and increased administrative experiences. My literature review revealed a paucity of data investigating any relationship between chief residency and race and ethnicity. So again, it's unsurprising to the people, especially in this room, that racial and gender disparities significantly impact career trajectory. I think more importantly, and again, as known, these are attached to bigger issues. So there's often discussion about recruitment, matriculation, but there's so much work to be done in terms of retention, advancement of trainees who may feel marginalized. I think everybody in this room is committed to this, but if we're truly attempting to advance in the House of Medicine, we have to think about diversity and inclusion not as a buzzword or pamphlet-worthy arrays of skin color or different shapes and sizes, but structural problems that are really buried into the fabric of our profession. My initial hypothesis were that there are current racial and gender disparities in chief residency selection as well as residency attrition in EM residency programs today. I also hypothesized and theorized that these in part reflected parallel disparities in performance evaluations. So using a comprehensive double AMC data set spanning from 2013 to 17, I found that the attrition rate of EM residents is approximately 1%. I did not find any significant gender or racial disparities. I think this is largely due to the fact that there wasn't a large enough N for meaningful analysis. So my biggest takeaway from this part is that emergency medicine is an excellent specialty. Our attrition rate is much lower than the general national standard. So my preliminary results regarding attrition were a little bit of a flop. But I'm glad I kept going. So using the same data set, I found that there are not significant gender disparities in chief residency selection for residents who identified as female compared to those who identified as male. The racial disparities, however, were significant and I think quite compelling. So the chance of being selected for promotion to chief resident is meaningfully reduced for residents who identify as Asian, Black, or Hispanic. Asian residents face an odds ratio of 73%, Hispanic residents 64%, and Black residents have less than half the chance as their white counterparts to be selected for chief resident. From a research standpoint, as a resident who had their first baby grand and bothered Dr. Agrawal at all times of the night to work on this, it was, I think, exciting to uncover something significant, but in the context of my position, experience, and values, this is extremely disappointing to find. In terms of next steps, I'm excited to dive more into analysis that combines this initial descriptive result with data on performance. The ACGME has a next accreditation system, the NAS, which uses nationally standard milestone evaluations to construct a competency system that training programs can utilize to evaluate residents. A score of 4 or more indicates readiness for unsupervised practice. These have already been applied to emergency medicine, and it may become more important as thresholds to determine residency advancement. Right now, this data set maintains a database for every EM resident in the United States for each year of training. So it currently spans nearly 14,500 unique residents across 200 programs. So my hope is that combining this data set, the ACGME data set with the AAMC data set, will allow systematic analysis of the association between gender, race, chief residency selection, and GME performance. And while the preliminary analysis investigated the presence and degree of disparities, I'm hoping the next part of the analysis will look at milestone scores and stratify those who were selected for chief residents by their performance values. I think this is something that's informative and applicable to training institutions who should be alerted to inequitable trends. I think we need to be proactive in monitoring biases in performance and promotion, especially since we know that these can recapitulate biases that unfairly impact career trajectories in the long term so that they don't remain unrecognized. So further research into the causal explanations can also inform policies and interventions that should be implemented to address these inequities in residency advancement. And overall, I'm excited to share this, and thank you, of course, to SAEM, to AWAEM, to Dr. Agrawal for bringing us together, and my contact information is listed there.
All right, now it's my turn. I'm Lauren Westbury, she, her pronouns, and I'm from UMass Chan Bay State in Western Massachusetts. And of course, we received an award, and then we're also, a couple team members are funded by NIH grants. We know that not only are there gender disparities from a binary standpoint within medicine, but also LGBTQ plus individuals also face significant biases in the workforce. Unfortunately, these studies capture almost zero trans or gender expansive individuals. And so we really wanted to understand this a little more richly, and so we used qualitative methods to do this. We undertook rigorous qualitative methods and ended up with a fairly diverse group. With regards to geography, we kind of got people from across the country. Also, when it comes to other areas of demographics, academic, about 50%, got a good bit of community and hybrid physicians as well. We had 9 emergency physicians, which was the largest specialty that we captured, but also had surgical specialties in pediatrics and family medicine as well. And then with regards to gender, we did have decent diversity there. We had about we had 8 transgender women, 8 transgender men, and about the same number that reported identifying as gender expansive, non-binary, genderqueer. With regards to timing of transition, a decent number transitioned as an attending. Very few transitioned during medical school. Some transitioned before medical school, but a lot transitioned at a very vulnerable time, which is before they became an attending after medical school, when they got that fresh start to become a resident. When we talked with them and we did a thematic analysis looking at the themes that arose, the major theme was emotional distress. And what was feeding into that were they experienced significant transphobia, isolation, and then repeated effects of misgendering. And what we found is that led to a lack of not only psychological safety, but physical safety as well. And the downstream effects of that were burnout, distraction from these repeated traumas on shift or in the OR, stunted professional development, and then what happens when you see nobody that looks like you, and when you're repeatedly traumatized, fewer people that are transgender and non-binary were encouraged to kind of seek out becoming a physician or even left the field. And just a trigger warning, I'm going to share quotes that kind of talk about transphobia. This one, talking about transphobia, the messaging that I largely heard, even in medical school, was that concomitant mental illness would make it impossible for a transgender person to ever be successful in a professional setting. This is what this transgender man was taught in medical school. Also, one thing that we may often not realize is there are transgender and gender expansive people walking in our midst that we don't know are transgender. And people carried that stress because what happened was the environment was transphobic when they didn't know that they were transgender. It's so hard for me to control the fire that explodes in my chest when someone gets misgendered. It's like instant dynamite. This man is responding to his colleagues misgendering his patients and the stress he feels from that because nobody else, so he has to cover it up to not out himself. Also, we just heard these themes over and over and over again. Stress from disclosure. Do I come out? Do I not? Because my colleagues, they don't, to my face, they would never tell me. They would never make those transphobic remarks. But since they don't know, it's safe at that time. And transitioning in medicine is hard for a lot of reasons. There's that timing, that fresh start. What we realized is everyone that transitioned between medical school and residency was outed by their program. Everyone was so excited to release their match list, they used old photos from the match and didn't confirm their pronouns, their new name, or their photo beforehand. So people were dead named and outed in the process. Now, what causes that? Well, we found that there's this dominance of this binary paradigm. Everyone talks about men and women. It's so ingrained, feminine and masculine, all of these traits and these gendered expectations. So for example, this person who's trans-masculine and non-binary, to everyone that knows them, they're trans because that is safe. But when you talk to them, they identify as trans and non-binary. At this point, it's safe enough to choose one or the other, but God forbid you're in the middle. It's not safe to not be man or woman. And then there's just the repeated misgendering. I like to use the phrase death by 1,000 cuts on shift. Every single time they're misgendered, that people assume their pronouns, it's traumatizing. And then just lack of physical spaces. People having to find out, where do I change on my anesthesia rotation? We talk to surgeons who say, I don't have a bathroom that's safe to use within a 5-minute walk of the OR. I'm in a 16-hour surgery. What do I do? Lots of structural factors that come into play there, the lack of physical spaces, etc. Also, lack of competency. All you have to do is be trans, and suddenly somebody can't take care of your hypertension. It's trans care, it's not primary care. And then there's the hierarchy in medicine. People being afraid to stand up for their patients because of that. People noting that their attendings frequently misgender them while their colleagues didn't. They said, their attendings said, it's too hard for me to learn your pronouns. It's too hard, that's a new thing. What we found, it's not all doom and gloom though. We found a lot of signs of affirmation, active allyship, representation, education, and proactive support. Seeing representation we know is important. It was revolutionary. I found somebody that looked like me. We need to recruit people that are diverse in medicine. Also, just proactively using pronouns. It's not virtue signaling, it's signaling that that space is safe. Things like pronoun pins, routinizing it in our steps. And then just active allyship. When we talked with everyone, the one thing they said, we said, what can we do? What if you could make a change, structural or whatever? They said, we as transgender humans, non-binary individuals, historically have been so low on the social ladder. They said, we can't do it alone. All we need is somebody to stand up and say, hey, this is not okay. All they did was they asked for their peers. If they heard a patient get misgendered, that EHR was wrong, they wanted to see their peers stand up and say, this is not okay. We have a lot of limitations in the study that we did, social desirability bias, selection bias. It's not meant to be generalizable in qualitative research, but our research, we think, provides a springboard for steps that we can take as individuals and then also as institutions to make emergency medicine and medicine in general a safer space for people of all genders. This is my contact information, and also our participants shared really vulnerable information with us, and so just to acknowledge the contributions that they made. Thanks.
Thank you to all of our presenters. That was all incredible. And what's also incredible is that everyone kept to their time. And actually, we have time for questions. So if anybody has any questions for any of our 5 speakers, we have probably about 10 minutes. And these are, I can put up the names of the studies if that would be easier. I'll do that.
It's not a question, but if anyone would like a pronoun pen for their badge.
Okay, any questions for anyone on our panel?
Sorry, there's leftovers from what we made for faculty and residents.
Does anyone want to talk about their next steps? This is kind of a pilot project. Talk about kind of where you're moving forward from here. Oh, here.
So given we know that there are fewer Black and brown residents coming into residency, how do you account for the lower numbers of them in the consideration for chief resident? Because if you just look at the statistics, they would be less likely simply by numbers. And so how are you going to explore that it is actually, bias and discrimination?
I think that's a really good point, something that we thought about. I think the good thing is by looking at data from 2013 to 2017, the N is pretty significant overall. We're also going to do nested analysis by residency program so that you're not comparing residents from different programs in the sense that when you're choosing chief resident, you're obviously being chosen relative to your peers at the same program. Part of that also is looking at other covariates. But I think it's something that overall, by the end that we have, hasn't been a problem so far.
Hi, I'm Jeanette Wolf from Bay State. I have a follow-up question. I've always been very curious as to how chief residents are chosen at different institutions, because it seems like maybe naively, maybe there is a cord, this is how you choose your chief resident platform, but it seems a little loosey-goosey in some of the criteria, and I wonder how much subjective bias, because I have brought up in the past, like, really you should not be asking me who I need to choose for a chief resident, because so much of a chief resident's job is administrative and scheduling. Probably our admin people know who needs to get 4 emails before they respond versus who responds in the first one, and I've always thought it was a little strange they weren't involved in the process.
Ours is very arbitrary at our institution. It's like, who do you like? And they send out a survey to the faculty, and there's no rubric at all. And yeah, they're like, oh, that one's always super friendly on shift, and like, he's easy to work with, as opposed to like, well, this person's like super responsible, answers every single email like within 24 hours, super organized. More, it's like, well, they're fun to work with. We'll choose them, and it's happened the last couple of years, and it's annoying.
So our group, we published the EM Girls study. I don't know when, I'm looking, 2020. And for that, we only looked at gender. But we found we were actually slightly overrepresented in chief residents, but we asked people, that was one of the questions, was we asked people like how they chose their chief residents. Were they selected by residents? Were they selected by faculty? Were they selected by a mix? And everybody in the country is doing different things, from what I remember from the data. It's not in the abstract, so I can't tell you exactly what it said. I think if you showed that there was not just gender, but also racial disparities, is that something we as a group could push for? Yes. But I'm trying to open the actual paper.
Yeah, I think you found exactly what I found, which is there's no, people are like, I don't know, like who's good for this? We were also talking a little bit before the presentations. every program has a different way of selecting for chief resident. And so one of the first questions that I have is like, is there actually any meaningful difference in performance? And I think no matter the result, that can be interpreted in several ways, right? Like it's not actually just about clinical skill. Also, if there are disparities between the women and trainees of color in performance, is it because they're getting, they're doing twice as much for half the value or half the recognition? Like, do they actually have greater performance scores than their peers? Do they have fewer performance? Also, the first question is, does performance actually matter for chief resident?
I don't know that this is any more structured than what anybody else is doing, but historically what we have done is rising senior residents who are interested write a statement applying for the position, and then there's a vote by the faculty. And then the education division, the PD and APDs, also use evaluations and their IT scores, which sometimes eliminates some people from the running, with the idea being that those residents need to work on themselves in their last year of residency and not be a chief. And then the PD has the final say, but they take the votes into consideration, the evaluations and ITE scores. And our senior education coordinator or program administrator also has a voice because of that administrative piece you mentioned. And, over the years that's fluctuated in terms of how much of, influence it had. But they definitely get a say in who the chiefs are going to be.
We have about 3 more minutes if there's any other questions. No? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for coming and for the presenters. These were inspirational. And we look forward to reading all your papers that are coming out of this, because that's the next step. If you have more ideas for projects, let's chat and we can come up with a way to get things done. All right, thank you.